Hi there, this is an explanatory video on your student's grade in chemistry. You'll see before you that it's a 100% scale, which is pretty traditional. A's, B's, and C's are earned in the regular grading scale. A student may earn an incomplete or an IP for in progress during the term if they are making adequate progress toward passing the course. Anything under a 60% would become an F at the end of the term, and in fact an I can also become an F at the end of the term if they have not satisfied the grading requirements. So for that, let's look at what they must do to pass the course. They must demonstrate mastery of each essential learning outcome and earn a 70% or better in the course. They may have an opportunity to pass those ELOs on quizzes. They can take the quiz once, twice, and they get plenty of practice during class if they do all the work to pass those ELOs. And then finally, at the end of the unit, they can demonstrate mastery on the unit test. We'll take a look at the grading categories in just a moment, but in case a student doesn't pass an ELO the first time, they can retake that quiz to demonstrate mastery, but they do need to show that they've completed the ELO practice work before they can retake the quiz. Once we get to the test, this is theoretically about the 5th, 6th, or 7th time the student has worked with the ELO material. So if they still don't pass those ELO questions, then at this point they must complete test corrections and get them approved before they can retake the test. Once students retake quizzes and or tests, their scores will be updated accordingly. Taking a look at the grading breakdown, the first category is what I call mastery, and it really does not contribute points to their grade, but it's a tracking system to show whether or not they have passed the ELOs. We'll see this on an example grade in a moment, but a 0 indicates that a student has not yet demonstrated mastery, and a 1 indicates that they have. Forms is a category where it's just I track whether or not parents, students have signed the syllabus, etc. The documentation and CER, which stands for Claim, Evidence, and Reasoning category. This is all unit work, model summaries, CERs outside of the material down in below in blue. This is 15% of the grade. Formal lab reports, there will be a handful of these throughout the term, 15% of their grade. And then a fancy way of saying final exam, application of combined concepts, that's 5% of their grade. Then we get to the unit content, which each of them will have approximately 4 ELOs. You can see our 7 units there, and that each has a relatively equal contribution to the grade with respect to percentage. Now if I take my example unit will be for Unit 3. So when I look at the Unit 3 grades for the student, items in that category would be broken down into either summative or formative, which you'll see at the bottom underneath the table. For example, the unit test would be 90% of this unit's grade, and formative things like ed puzzles or other small learning opportunities would be 10% of their grade. Let's take a closer look at what the ELOs might entail. Here's an example of some ELOs from Unit 1, and you'll see that there are 4, and it's a very specific statement about what a student must be able to do, and it specifies which quiz they will have in their first opportunity to demonstrate mastery of. Feel free to pause the video here to read through some of these ELOs. Here we have an example grade of a student, and I've just selected the items from Unit 3. And you can look at your student's grade in Aries. I encourage you to look at the list or table view as opposed to the card view. It gives you more detail on their grade. So you'll see the item number, its description, the category that it falls in, which is the weighting, whether or not the grading has been completed, when it's due, and then now moving over to the blue column headings, you'll see the correct score, the number of correct, and the number correct possible, and the relative percentage of that. The points earned and points possible is the same as the number correct and number possible because of the 100% system. And then on the far right, you'll see comments. I will add comments here if a student retakes an ELO or repeats a lab report. You'll see that it was maybe a 2nd or 3rd grade. So let's break this down. Remember that the student must pass all ELOs to pass the course. We're looking for 1s, not 0s. This would be in the mastery category. And they must earn at least a 70% in the course. Each unit, remember, makes up an approximately equal percentage of their grade, with 90% of the tests, the summatives being in tests, and 10% is formative for ed puzzles. All right, lab reports. So lab reports contribute about 15% of their entire grade. They do approximately 4 per term. The student did well on this with a 90%. Here in green, you'll see the documentation and claim evidence and reasoning category represented at 15%. Each unit has at least a couple of items in this category, so the points get distributed pretty evenly throughout the term. They'll have their model summary that they turn in at the end of the unit, and then there will be 1 to 2 or 3 CERs, or claim evidence and reasoning, for each unit. And the student did about 15 out of 23 on the model summary, which is only a 65%, so not their best work. And then the CER down at the bottom was a 79%, so decent, and they could make some corrections to that CER if they wanted to earn more points. Now in blue here, what you'll see are the summative and formative points represented, as I mentioned before, where each unit is broken down into summative and formative grades. Here at the top, the summative is going to be heavily weighted at 90%, and these are the 2 test scores. They take 1 test, but the test is broken down into ELO and non-ELO material. The ELO material is what we really focus on, and we practice over and over and over again. And as I mentioned before, by the time they get to the ELO portion of the test, this could be anywhere between their 5th and 7th time of seeing this material. So they should really do a good job at this point. The non-ELO material is less emphasized, but it still represents material that has been assigned, and students don't always give that as much attention as reflected by the student's grade on the non-ELO portion of the test. Remember that they can retake tests, but they have to do test corrections and get them approved before they can retake it. And then at the bottom, you'll see an ed puzzle, which contributes to that 10% formative category of the grade, and they did just fine on that. Now let's take a look at the mastery category. Here you'll see those individual ELOs represented. There are 4 for this unit, and you can see their titles, and let's take a look at their scores. So for heating and cooling curves, the student demonstrated mastery. You'll see that as the 1, and that they actually passed it on the unit test. Here we see the energy bar graphs. There's a 0 there, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then the heating and cooling curve calculations, they passed this on a quiz retake. So that's something that they maybe didn't pass initially, but then they did a quiz retake, and then they did demonstrate mastery. And then lastly, ELO 3.4, law of conservation of heat calculations, a student passed that on the test. So notice that ELO 3.2, the student has not yet passed. So that's extremely important, because if we look at their grade and just the percentage, we're going to assume the student is doing just fine. However, because of this 0 for this particular ELO, it means that this student has not demonstrated mastery of all the ELOs yet, and that's the first requirement to pass the course. So the 2 most important things for you to take a look at are the overall percentage, and then whether or not they are passing all of the ELOs. And this student is not yet passing that 1, so even though they have a B- according to Aries, Aries hasn't really figured out a way to show whether or not they're passing. So you need to take a deeper dive in your student's grade and make sure that these 2 requirements are being met. And I hope that that's helpful.